Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm Jennifer Nyman. I'm a senior principal at Geosyntec Consultants in Oakland, California. I'm the coordinator of the webinar series on behalf of SERDP and ESTCP, and I will be facilitating today's event. Today's webinar focuses on DoD-funded research efforts to develop PFAS-free firefighting foams. First, Dr. Carrie Dutcher of the University of Minnesota Twin Cities will discuss research into mechanical factors applicable to both firefighting foams and bilgewater emissions that govern emulsion and foam destabilization in surfactants. Second, Dr. Katie Hinnant of the Naval Research Laboratory will present research on synergism of fluorine-free siloxane and alkypolyglycoside surfactant to develop an optimized mixture. Each of our presentations today will be followed by a brief question and answer session. And then we will conclude the webinar today with a question and answer session with both of our speakers. The next two slides provide some instructions for your webinar today. If you haven't done so, you can download Zoom at the link shown here and provided to you in your webinar registration confirmation email. If you cannot download Zoom, you can view the slides using a compatible internet browser like Firefox or Edge, and by creating a free Zoom account. If you still are unable to view the slides, or if your screen is freezing, you can always try keying in Control and F5 to perform a hard refresh. In the case of continued technical difficulties, you can download a PDF of the slides from the webinar webpage at SERDP and ESTCP and call into the conference line provided to you in your webinar registration confirmation email. And we will also be live streaming the webinar on the SERDP and ESTCP YouTube channel at the link shown here. Today's broadcast is listen only. You can submit questions using the Q&A box that's on the Zoom screen. You don't have to wait until that Q&A period to submit your questions. In fact, we encourage you to submit questions in advance of that session. When you submit your questions, please make sure to add your name of your organization at the end of the question. And please do not submit questions in the chat box. We're going to reserve the chat function just for technical difficulties. And with that, I would like to introduce Dr. John Lascala, who is the SERDP and ESTCP Program Manager for Weapon Systems and Platforms. Prior to joining SERDP and ESTCP, John served as the Chief of the Manufacturing Sciences and Technology Branch in the Weapons and Materials Research Directorate of the DevCom Army Research Laboratory. John is the recipient of numerous awards for his work on polymers, including the 2013 Presidential Green Chemistry and Engineering Challenge Award. John, please proceed.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Jennifer. I'm happy to welcome everyone to today's SERDP and ESTCP webinar. The next few slides. I knew that was going to happen. Sorry, phone rang as soon as I started this. Anyway, the next few slides will provide a quick overview of SERDP and ESTCP. SERDP and ESTCP are the Department of Defense's investments in environment and installation energy science and technology. The programs report to the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Energy Resilience and Optimization, headquartered at the Pentagon. SERDP is the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program established by Congress as a partnership between the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, and the EPA. SERDP addresses high-priority environmental science and technology opportunities that focus on the top priority DoD requirements. SERDP funds both fundamental research as well as advanced technology development that ultimately impact real-world environmental management. ESTCP is the Environmental Security Technology Certification Program, in which we demonstrate and validate innovative environmental and installation energy technologies. These investments capitalize on past investments under SERDP or other research programs and are designed to transition technology out of the lab and into the field. Especially important in all ESTCP demonstrations is the ultimate transition to implementation and regulatory acceptance. Advances in science and technology provide the DoD with the tools needed to effectively manage and restore its assets to protect troops, their families, the public, and the environment. SERDP and ESTCP investments improve installation and energy resilience, environmental cleanup, UXO remediation, resource conservation, and the sustainment and maintenance of defense assets. Next slide. SERDP and ESTCP fund, monitor, and actively guide relevant and applied research, development, testing, and evaluation projects for the DoD's top environment and installation energy challenges. Our programs currently fund over 600 active projects. To maximize research impact, SERDP and ESTCP collaborate with top talent across sectors. In 2023, we funded projects at 77 academic institutions, 91 federal performers, and 52 industry partners. Our innovation and technology development inform DoD policy to ultimately improve environmental and energy management. SERDP and ESTCP are funding a broad range of PFAS-related projects. You can access an overview of our PFAS programs as well as project descriptions on our website. You can see here, I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but there are basically a lot of these technology areas, the colors focus on different areas of focus of PFAS efforts. Some of these are focused in particular on fluorine-free foam development, which is going to be the subject of today's presentations, as well as the toxicity environmental fate of those. There are various other projects with some of these other colors that focus on understanding PFAS, destruction of PFAS, sequestering of PFAS to clean up water and our lands from AFFF and PFAS contamination in general. And basically, the boxes along the top of the graph illustrate workshops that have been held to develop a strategic plan for addressing PFAS issues. A summary report was prepared for each workshop to summarize the discussions and to identify research, demonstration, and technology transfer needs. To view workshop reports on the website, you can click these boxes at the top. Each SERDP project has an associated box with a project title, which links to a full description of the project, as well as any reports that have been published as a part of the project. Each ESTCP topic listed represents a single topic. Click the project title to go to the project webpage. Our webinar series highlights outstanding projects across all of our main focus areas. Registration is open for webinars through the end of this year. And you can see the next few coming up. You can find additional information about upcoming webinars at this link. All past webinars are archived and can be accessed using this link. Please save the date for the 2024 symposium, which will be held from December 3rd to the 6th in Washington, D.C. Symposium registration is open and the program agenda is available on the symposium website. I'd like to remind you that a copy of the presentation of today's session can be downloaded from our webinar page. We would appreciate it if you can please take a moment to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen at the end of the webcast. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer to introduce our fine speakers today. We have a great couple of presentations from some excellent presenters and doing great work in this subject area. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoy the webinar.
Thank you so much, John. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Dr. Carrie Dutcher, who is a professor of mechanical engineering, chemical engineering, and materials science at the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. Her research interests are in complex fluids and multi-phase flows, including emulsions, suspensions, aerosols, and foams. Prior to her faculty position, Carrie was a National Science Foundation Atmospheric and Geospace Sciences postdoctoral research fellow in the Air Quality Research Center at the University of California, Davis. She received a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the Illinois Institute of Technology and a doctoral degree in chemical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley. Carrie, please proceed.
Great, thank you so much. Welcome, everyone. I'm very excited to talk to you about work that we're doing at the University of Minnesota in the area of surfactant transport at fluid-fluid interfaces, from bilgewater emulsions to firefighting foams. I'm going to be presenting some of the approaches and conclusions of our SERDP project and the benefits to the DoD. And one of the interesting things about our SERDP project is that it has two application areas of interest. The first is in the area of bilgewater emulsions. These are oily wastewater emulsions that you find aboard ships where water comes aboard the ship and then by gravity will drain to the bottom chamber of the bilge of the ship, and it picks up engine oils and diesel fuels as well as contaminants and molecules from deck cleaners and that contain surfactant molecules and other additives. These oily wastewaters cannot just be discharged overboard, but have to be treated to remove the oil to a level of below 15 parts per million. And this can be relatively easy for larger oil droplets. There's a density difference, and so the oil could cream to the top and you can remove the oil that way. But for the smaller oil droplets, the colloidal scale droplets, this can be relatively difficult to remove, that these oil droplets will remain suspended by Brownian motion, by this kinetic energy, and you have to have some kind of secondary treatment technique to remove that oil from the water, or you just have to store it shipboard. So there's a need for improved mitigation strategies to increase the volume of water that can be discharged. And to improve those strategies, we need improved fundamental understanding of how these complex oily systems are stabilized and destabilized. Likewise, we look at firefighting foams. This is another complex multi-phase system. And in firefighting foams, there's air, of course, the bubbles inside of the foam, water, additives that are inside the water phase to create the foam, things like surfactants, maybe polymers, other compounds. There's fuels. These are Class B firefighting foams, so they're spread on a liquid fuel. So you can have emulsification of the fuel in the foam blanket. And then, of course, the foam fuel vapor. You're trying to prevent the fuel vapor transport across the foam. And so you can have fuel vapor that can get into the foam. You can have condensation of the fuel. The fuel is quite important for the foam stability. And then possible salts, depending on the water source. So maybe seawater would have quite a bit of salt. And traditionally, these firefighting foams contain PFAS materials that work to enable film formation. That you have a foam over the fuel, and a thin liquid film will form between the foam and the fuel, and it will spread across the fuel surface, which is a remarkable thing because the water has a high surface energy and the fuel has a low surface energy, and it's difficult to make high surface energy spread on low. But the PFAS materials have a unique property that enable that film formation and thermodynamic favorability for spreading. However, these PFAS material exposures are known to associate with health effects, and now there's need for improved formulations that replace PFAS. And to enable improved formulation, we need improved fundamental understanding of how these systems are stabilized. And our group really focuses on the soluble surfactants and their transport mechanism, how they get to interfaces, and how they stabilize them. Because both these bilgewater emulsions and firefighting foams contain these surfactants. Now, these surfactants will move to interfaces through processes like diffusion as soon as an interface is present. And then when it gets into the subphase, the processes of absorption and desorption until equilibrium is reached. And these surfactants, as they absorb, they lower the interfacial tension, and they also lower the excess energy per area. And that's important because these oil and water, water and air, that wants to phase separate. But when you lower the interfacial tension, you're lowering the thermodynamic penalty of having that interface there. So you can enable stabilized foams and emulsions. But that behavior of the surfactant, how it gets to interfaces, and then really what's going on the interface, especially in dynamic conditions where things are changing and flowing, and there's gradients, that really varies. And it varies depending on the surfactant type and its concentration, as well as its local environment. What's the viscosity around it? Even what's the size of the bubble or droplet. The curvature of the interface will inform some of the transport rates to that interface and the underlying transport mechanism. So in our approach to study these soluble surfactants, we take two approaches. First, we measure the absorption to a single interface. We do this to bubbles and to droplets and across length scales. We start with macro scale techniques like the pendant drop or a rising bubble, where the approach is to measure interfacial tension by looking at the shape deformation of that object, of the bubble and drop, and then you use Young-Laplace equations to get surface tension from there. And that's using gravity to help deform the bubble and drop. And then we push down to microscale methods like the microfluidic tensiometer, where bubbles are deformed and flow, and then static environments like the capillary pressure microtensiometer through a collaboration with Joe Zedinsky at the University of Minnesota to measure transport to highly curved interface at length scales that are quite relevant to our application. But then it's not just about getting surfactants to a single interface. Ultimately, in foams and emulsions, it's not just the single interfaces, but two interfaces near each other that's important. It's the thin films that form between the bubble drops or the fuel droplets that inform the stability. So we look at the film between two drops and two bubbles and study the film drainage and rupture time. We do this for a variety of systems. These are largely informed through collaborations and the co-investigators at DoD laboratories that for systems that are relevant to emulsions and foams of interest. We look at hydrocarbon surfactants, alkypolyglycosides, and siloxane surfactants and their mixtures that have shown synergism against fire and fire suppression, as well as informed by our prior work, SERDP effort, simulated detergent mix and bilgewater mixes that have been recommended through Carter-Rock. And so looking at these systems for our water phase, we add different things to it like salts, as well as surfactants and polymers. Our disperse phase can be bubbles for the foams, the air, but it can also be things like light mineral oil to mimic the engine oil, different fuels in the simulated mix. And then the fuel phase itself can be quite complex. It can have different compounds and additives and even surfactants that are present in those phases. And our starting point is often looking at equilibrium properties. So this is an example of equilibrium interfacial tension versus concentration. And with increasing concentration of the surfactant, those equilibrium tensions will drop. And it'll go from a less stable system to a more stable system because of the stabilization of that interface. Now you're looking at three different curves here. In the outermost curves, the triangles with the blue and the green are the glucoside surfactant and siloxane surfactant, and they have different profiles. And then a mixture at that same concentration as the individual component curves. And you'll see that the mixture is just largely dominated by that siloxane surfactant, that it has a profile that tends to match that better surfactant, that the siloxane is dictating a lot about the surface coverage at that interface of the mixture. And this is a mixture that's shown synergism against the fire, and you'll hear more about that next. So at equilibrium, we see an important role of the siloxane surfactant. But the journey to the equilibrium is also important. And so we look at the dynamics. All 6 of these panels are surface tension versus time. And the left-handmost and the right-handmost are individual surfactants, the glucoside and the siloxane surfactant. And then the middle column is the mixture of the two, again, at the same total concentration as we study the individual components. In those middle columns, you'll see that they really seem to reflect the dynamics of the siloxane surfactant. That faster, better surfactant is also dictating the behavior in terms of absorption of the mixture. Now, the top row is that pinned and drop or rising bubble method at the larger millimeter scale. And then the bottom row is a different method for measuring interfacial tension. That's the microcapillary tensiometer. And we see that same closeness in the behavior of the mixture to the siloxane across length scales. We also see this across fuel types. We do a lot with interfacial tension, and we see that same behavior. And then also at higher temperatures, we see the same behavior. But I choose to compare it against the smaller length scale because you can also see the acceleration that happens in the absorption. These curves are sort of pressed up against the y-axis. In fact, to really show it, you would want to think about plotting it versus a log of time. And that acceleration is because of that curvature to the interface, approaching the interface. That against the surface, you've got a certain region that would contain all the surfactant needed to cover that interface at equilibrium. So there's some volume at that bulk concentration that would contain that surfactant that could cover the interface. And as you begin to curve the interface and you have more and more area, the depth of that volume will decrease. So that depletion depth will get smaller, and that's the depletion depth that's defining the difference between the bulk to the surface. And it's the length scale for the diffusional mass flux. So that's smaller and smaller, gets faster and faster, and you see this acceleration. So we take that kind of measurements, those are diffusion limited measurements, and we begin to measure traditional metrics like critical micelle concentration, the diffusivity by fitting the time-dependent response to a mass flux equation, maximum surface coverage, that's quite important, though it doesn't tend to vary much between surfactant, and then things like equilibrium constants, depending on what isotherm you use. And so I'm just plotting here some representative values of some of the equilibrium constants for different glucosides and siloxane surfactants and their mixtures, and how they might compare to other common surfactants. And so this varies over orders of magnitude, and it could potentially be a metric for the stability of the foam and film. Because if you dig into this equilibrium constant. This is actually the ratio of the absorption and desorption rate of the surfactant. Now from pin and drop, you'll just get the ratio, but if you have this other measurement technique where you can push yourself out of the diffusion limited regime, you have another method where with the second method, you can then not just get the ratio, but the individual rates. And so you can tease out both the absorption and desorption rate constants. We do this as a function of concentration of surfactant, of temperature, and then I thought this was an interesting one to highlight phase of the surfactant. So you can imagine a wet or a dry bilge, so oil and water or water and oil, but the phase that the surfactant's in will dictate the rate at which it's absorbed. And this is somewhat well known that there's a Bancroft rule of thumb that if you had water and oil and surfactant and you shake it up, do you get water and oil or oil and water? And you'll typically get the system will typically form where the surfactant, whatever phase the surfactant is soluble in, that tends to be the continuous phase. And so it'll tend to form these Bancroft type emulsions. And what we show is that when you have this configuration, you typically will have faster absorption to that interface. So it aligns well with that rule of thumb of you would have this be the stabilized system. So we're gonna look into this a little bit more in a few slides. So in addition to looking at measurements to individual interfaces, as I mentioned earlier, ultimately we want to know how stable those interfaces are as they approach each other, because you have a number of thin films present in emulsions and foams, and coalescence between drops and bubbles are one of the key mechanisms for destabilization, among some others, and they're present in both emulsions and foams. So we use microfluidic methods to create an array of droplets and bubbles, and we look at coalescence events. So that's shown in the example here is a number of bubbles that have been formed as a function of Triton X concentration. And you can see differences in their size distribution and in their coalescence dynamics. And in general, the lower the coalescence frequency, the more stable the system. And then we dig in closer where we look not just on ensemble kinetics, but just individual events. So we can use a microfluidic Stokes trap where we control the pressures in each of these channels, and there's a stagnation point in the middle, and we can trap one droplet or one bubble and then throw another one at it and look at the time it takes for those two drops to merge. And coalescence is a really complicated process. You've got the outer problem of the rate at which they collide, the angle at which they collide, and then once they come in contact and you've got that thin film that forms between them, they don't immediately merge. There's a timescale associated with that film to drain from going from a thick to a thin film. That's largely dominated by changes in capillary pressure. And then a thin film to a very thin film, in the orders of nanometers, where you'll start to have instability and rupture. And so each of these three phases have their own metric and parameters that define them. But in general, the longer it takes, the more stable that foam and emulsion. So we look at coalescence across that wide range of systems I showed you earlier, including the effect of salt. And I thought this was an interesting one to highlight because it's somewhat unexpected. Here we have salt in our water-rich phase, and surfactant is in the oil phase. So the only way the salt and the surfactants interact are at the interface. And I'm not showing you that first bullet point, but I can just tell you that interfacial measurements, if you add salt to that aqueous phase and this non-ionic surfactant to the oil phase, you'll see a decrease in the interfacial tension. And this is well known, but if you're from outside this field, it might be surprising because you know that salt typically increases interfacial and surface tension in the absence of the surfactant, but it interacts with the surfactant so much that it will decrease the interfacial tension when the surfactant is present. And then we look at the coalescence, the dimensionless film drainage time versus concentration. And what we see is that below CMC, the critical micelle concentration, that indeed we see increases in the drainage time. It's more stable in the presence of the salt than without the salt, corresponding well to those interfacial tension measurements. So we look at the effect of additives as well as the effect of viscosity of the fuel phase. This is important because fuel can really range in viscosity because of difference in temperature, but just inherent to the fuel. Some fuels are less or more viscous than water. And that viscosity is quite important. Viscosity in general will slow things down, but the ratio will be important. If I had a highly viscous drop, a highly viscous fuel drop in water, and you're trying to coalesce them, it's quite challenging. Even in the absence of surfactant, if you had hexadecane droplets, it's quite difficult to have them coalesce, largely because you're changing the surface stresses and you're changing the mobility of the liquid in that film phase as it's draining. Conversely, if you had low viscosity droplets, like heptane inside of water, then they more readily coalesce, even in the presence of surfactant. So surfactant is important, of course, and in general, if you add surfactant, you stabilize the system. And that's what we see for the most part for most systems, increased film drainage time versus surfactant concentration. But there are some circumstances where we see some non-monotonic effects. So for example, if you had surfactant in these anti-Bancroft type emulsions, where the surfactant's inside the water phase and we're coalescing it inside this oil, we'll see initially an increase in the drainage time, just like you would expect with increasing surfactant concentration. But then if you add even more surfactant, it actually hurts the stability. It tends to drop down the drainage time up to a point, and then you get quite a bit of scatter in the data. For Triton X surfactants, we see that scatter happen at CMC. These glucopones, we see them at a little bit lower concentration, but it's a somewhat surprising non-monotonic effect. So we have all these observations that are interesting, or some are expected, and we take these measurements and then we couple them with some modeling, some fluid dynamic modeling to capture that thin film. And this is in collaboration with co-investigator Satish Kumar here at the University of Minnesota, and our co-vice graduate student Xu Yang, and she's looking at the stability of this thin liquid film that forms between the bubbles and the drops. And we think about what are the forces that stabilize and destabilize them. And one of the key destabilizing mechanisms is because of van der Waals level interactions, intermolecular interactions that happen between interfaces, captured by the disjoining pressure, which has what's called the Hamaker constant in it. And for any interface, there's always natural fluctuations because of this natural fluctuation of kinetic energy, thermal energy. And as you have that fluctuation, you'll have moments in time where you have a bit of a trough and a bit of a peak that form. And for a thin enough film, you'll have quite a difference in the strength of that attractive van der Waals interaction, that the area where it's quite thin or a little bit thinner than the thicker area, it'll feel a much stronger attraction than the thicker region because of how strongly it depends on the thickness of the film. These will really kick in around 100 nanometers or less. And so these thin areas will have a driving force to get even thinner, and the thick areas even thicker. And that's how you'll get rupture in these thin films. But these forces are counteracted by stabilizing forces. The first is capillary leveling, that if you had two systems at equilibrium and a flat interface between them, the pressures are the same on both sides. But the moment you have a curved interface, you have a Laplace pressure difference. And so inside bubbles, inside droplets are higher pressure than outside of them because of this Laplace pressure needed to stabilize this, this interface. And so in a film, when you have peaks and you have troughs, in the region below the peak, it's a higher pressure, it's on this concave side, and then below the trough, it's a lower pressure. And flow likes to go from high to low pressure, and so it tends to flatten out peaks and fill in troughs. This is with or without surfactant. And then if you add surfactant to this system, as you have it flowing during this natural fluctuation from regions from peaks to trough, it'll move the surfactant with it, and you'll begin to have regions of high surfactant concentration and low surfactant concentration. And this sets up a Marangoni stress, and you'll have an interfacial Marangoni flow where the flow will go from regions of high surfactant concentration to low surfactant concentration because of a surface tension difference. So those are the stabilizing and destabilizing forces. And so we begin to model monolayers and bilayers, ultimately trilayers. But the bilayers, I'll just pause at the bilayers to mention that this itself could be interesting to the application, that you could have a thin liquid film of water that can form on top of the fuel, and then we could look at the stability of that thin film in the presence of these surfactants. We looked at a number of different components, a wide parameter space, but the one I want to highlight here is what happens with the concentration of surfactant. So you're looking at dominant growth rate. This is a term from linear stability analysis. And the higher the rate of growth of an instability, the faster it would rupture. So this is quickly rupturing. As you go to low dominant growth rates, it's slowly rupturing. So less stable for high values, more stable for low values. And then log of Marangoni numbers, you could think of that as a metric for the concentration of the surfactant. And as you add surfactant, you stabilize the system, regardless of what interface, although depending on what interface, you stabilize it to different degrees. But what's interesting is you add too much surfactant and you drop the interfacial tension too much, you actually can destabilize the system. So Marangoni stresses are always stabilizing. But what happens here is you're dropping the interfacial tension so much that you're suppressing that stabilizing capillary pressure difference. And then you're also just suppressing and decreasing the capillary length scale, and you're making your interface easier to deform. So in these really thin films, that becomes quite important, and you can cause rupture to happen more readily. So you can have enough surfactant to help, but too much could hurt in that scenario. So that non-monotonic effect. And then we built up to the tri-layer. So now we're more closely mimicking the emulsions and the foams, where you would have a disperse phase and then the thin film between it. And so here, when you zoom in, you would think of the film of interest as this is actually the continuous phase. That's what's the film between the two disperse phases. And then these outer films would be a mimic of the drop phase. And so we look at this as functions of surfactant concentration and even looking at different rates of diffusion limited, absorption limited processes, and even viscosity ratio like we did in the experiments. And in general, if you increase the viscosity, you do tend to slow things down. But just like with the experiments, the ratio matters. That if you have a more viscous droplet phase or a more viscous outer phase, you'll stabilize the system more than if you had the other way around. And what's nice about the modeling is you can begin to zoom in not just on the thickness of the film, but also the surfactant coverage at the location, and you can recover velocity gradients. And so you can begin to tease out some more complex mechanisms of stability, like that Bancroft rule. So if we add surfactant to different phases, as we saw earlier in the experiments, we saw these faster absorption when surfactants are from the outside and the inside, and these tend to be the more stable system. So we looked at the same system, but in the thin film environment. And again, dominant growth rate versus, in this case, it's versus how soluble the surfactant is. And we go from a limit of completely soluble, it's not even surfactant-like, to completely insoluble. All of it just sits in the interface, just like a Langmuir interface. And then in between are the soluble surfactants of interest. And in general, if the surfactant is soluble in the interface, that would correspond to the continuous phase of the emulsion, it tends to stabilize at earlier solubility limits values than when it's stable in the outer phase. And this also depends on the thickness of the film, so the size of the bubble or droplet. And so what's happening is when you're coming from the inside, where you have these two surfaces in this thin area versus outside, you have differences in the concentration gradients that are set up in the fluxes of the interface. And so you'll have different rates at which the surfactants will absorb, and you can erase some surfactant concentration gradients at the surface that'll weaken Marangoni stresses and then either stabilize or destabilize that interface. So we've looked at a number of different scenarios with the modeling and with these measurements, and we can look at the effect of composition of surfactants, of salts and fuels on the absorption, on the stability. We did polymers as well. I just haven't mentioned it in this talk. And we focused on both the equilibrium properties, but really trying to get at dynamics and seeing that this faster surfactant will dominate the behavior. We also looked at compositional effects, and we found, and I showed you some surprising and some expected behaviors where you found changes of stability with changing absorption. We also saw the non-monotonic effect from concentration, and then stability with these viscous droplets and continuous phase solubility. So we did this with these end applications in mind. So all the systems we looked at were informed by systems that are typical to these bilgewater systems or firefighting foams, and have enabled some new measurements and modeling platforms, as well as some modeling methods and results that can be used in a diagnostic way to inform operation, mitigation strategy, and formulation. And so I just want to acknowledge the co-investigators in this project, Satish, Jared, and Katie, who you'll hear from next, as well as our collaborator, Joseph Zazinski, and then students Yoon, Shihao, Minal, Shu, Rana, and Chinmayi. And then I also want to point you to this page for the project, because the final report, which is currently under review, which will be posted there, has a lot more information about these projects and what I've shown here today, as well as a list of the references where you'll see the publications that they correspond to. So thank you very much for your time, and I'm happy to take questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I just want to remind our audience that you can submit your questions for Carrie using the Q&A box on the Zoom screen. And Carrie, we do have a few questions for you already. The first is from the Army Engineer Research and Development Center. With respect to the maximum surface coverage using the pendant bubble and the microtensiometer, you mentioned that maximum coverage tends to be similar for most surfactants. So there's two questions. First, have you also looked at mixtures with respect to that conclusion?
That's a great question. And when I say similar, I actually just kind of mean within an order of magnitude. So they can vary, by some factors of 2 or 4. But the mixture question, we did look at the surface coverage from the mixture. And in general, the surface coverage does, at least for those mixtures I showed earlier, do seem to approach that of the siloxane as well. But it's not quite as clear as the dynamics would suggest. So yeah, I'd have to look a little bit closer into the numbers to answer it more readily. But yes, we do try to also get the surface coverage in the presence of mixtures in the individual component. And it can vary, but typically is the same order of magnitude in value.
Okay. Have you observed any surfactant double layers or other unique coverages with the mixtures?
We haven't looked that closely. The way that we would potentially look at it is in the context of the modeling and how we treat that. And we have begin to lift this idea of having vertical average concentrations beneath the surface to allow some gradients. And so I can imagine also incorporating some double layer effects, but we haven't looked into that. It's a good suggestion.
Okay. Can you explain what the surfactants or other additives are doing that prevent the coalescence?
Yeah, so at their basic level, I'd say they're doing 2 things. One is that they're modifying the surface stresses. And so I showed a little bit of that with changing interfacial tension, the Marangoni stress. They can also add some viscoelasticity to the interface, so these deviatoric material functions. But then they can also change the disjoining pressure or the film stability. So in addition to being present at the surface, you can have things like micelles or polymers in the film. And so that'll change the way that the interfaces approach each other. So you can do this through what's called DLVO type interactions through electrostatics, where you have charged surfactants at the interfaces and they repulse each other, or more steric effects like those micelles that create structure in the interface. And then to add to that, they often tend to also interact with the fuel. And so the fuel is quite important for the stability of these foams. And so these surfactants in some way can interact with the fuel transport through the foam.
To follow up on that, then what is the role of the type of fuel in stabilizing or destabilizing the foam?
Yeah, so the question of the fuel surfactant foam interaction is a really big one, and I'd say it's a big area of research for a number of people. So the fuel, ultimately trying to get the foam to cut off the fuel from the oxygen-rich phase above it, and the fuel vapor would have to transport through that foam. And so the oleophobicity, the kind of wetting of the surfactant and how that interacts with that foam, the fuel is quite important. So how soluble is that surfactant in the fuel phase? How would the surfactant interact with the fuel vapor, and as well as any soluble fuel in the lamello phase? That's all important. And I think Katie will talk a little bit about it too, but then there's also quite a bit of literature out there in this topic.
Okay. And can you summarize, is there any correlation between bulk concentration and interface thickness?
So there's definitely a correlation. Oh, sorry, the interface thickness in terms of surfactant coverage, definitely there's a relationship, that partitioning between the bulk and the surface. But then is the question maybe about the film thickness?
I think so, yes.
Okay. So yes, okay, so the film thickness and bulk concentration, I would imagine there also is a correlation there because of those 2 important forces, where you're having more at the interface, so you're creating more of potentially that DLVO repulsive forces between the interface, especially with charged surfactants. But then at high enough concentration, then you have the formation of the micelles, which would add to the thickness of the interface. So I think kind of indirectly, it would increase the film thickness.
Sounds good. The next question is from the USGS, and the audience member notes that divalent cations can have more of an effect on some of these processes compared to monovalent cations. So could divalent cations like magnesium and calcium drive differences between seawater and sodium chloride?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The divalent cations are very important. These lead to very different interfacial properties. You know, the project with the salt and the surfactant, it's the cation and magnesium ions will lead to very different instabilities. And in fact, you can, with the divalent ones, there's some studies that show that you can get more structure at the interface just because of these additional interactions and almost like a gel type formation that can form at the interface. It'll certainly change the solubility of the surfactant and these other components. So it's quite important. I agree.
Very interesting. And I think we just have one last question for you right now, and that's about polymers. You mentioned also studying polymers. Did you find that they stabilized the foams?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the polymers we were looking at the changes of the foam stability of surfactant and polymer, and then the liquid foam. And over water, there's, you know, it had no impact. But then over fuel, we were seeing that the polymers at optimal concentrations would stabilize the foam. So no polymer and too much polymer would actually destabilize it, but for optimal concentration, it would tend to stabilize. And that's just something that we're continuing to look into and trying to understand.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carrie. And to our audience, if you have more questions for Carrie, you can type them into the Q&A box, and we can bring Carrie back at the end of the webinar to answer more questions.
Thank you.
Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next presenter, Dr. Katie Hinnant, a chemical engineer at the United States Naval Research Laboratory in Washington, D.C. She has 9 years of experience in fire suppression research. She uses laser-based experimental methods to probe fire environments during fire suppression, and she designs experiments to quantify fuel-foam interactions. Katie also conducts solution and chemical property assessments of firefighting foams for military qualification. She received a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Virginia and master's and doctoral degrees in chemistry from George Washington University. Katie, please go ahead.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you, SERDP and ESTCP, for this opportunity to discuss our research related to fluorine-free foams. This is a really fascinating research area that NRL has been involved in for a very long time. So excited to kind of get our research out there and take some questions. So my presentation will be focusing on some history about firefighting foams and NRL's history in them in particular. And then it will be transitioning into how what we've known about firefighting foams has changed within the last 10 years and how NRL has really used our data and our research to better understand that change and develop new fluorine-free foams based on surfactant synergism and based on our own synthesis of new surfactants. And then I'll conclude and discuss some benefits to the DoD. So just wanted to go over the history of AFFF and the use of foams to fight fires. So foams have been used since the 1940s to extinguish liquid fuel pool fires, and specifically foams were used for this application because when you have a fuel pool, if it is on fire, and you try to put water onto that surface, because the water is more dense than your fuel layer, the water just sinks below the surface, and you're not actually applying an agent to your fire interface, which is at the fuel air interface. When you use a foam, the foam is less dense than the fuel, and the water that is in that foam layer is going to cool the fuel surface and is going to be used as your fire suppressant. And in the 1940s, it was acceptable to just kind of use anything. They used soaps, protein-based surfactants, and it was deemed good enough to extinguish a fire. However, there were situations, particularly for military use, in which that was just not good enough. We would have situations in which the fire, but then as soon as a firefighter would extinguish one area of the flame, it would reignite. And this is a really big deal when you're thinking about large pool fires. I think we might have in our minds maybe a small grease trap and how do you put that out, but you have to think about this on the scale of an entire flight deck or a very large area that is on fire. And as firefighters move forward into that fire, they need to have some assurance and some protection that the fire that they have already extinguished is not going to reignite. And this was not the case for these inferior protein-based foams. So in comes AFFF, aqueous film forming foams, which were developed in the 1960s at the U.S. Naval Research Lab, which I'll refer to as NRL. And looking back through those studies, I can say with confidence that fluorinated materials were provided to NRL and were evaluated, and they worked incredibly well. There were a series of large-scale tests with larger and larger fires, and the fluorinated surfactants worked amazingly. So they were chosen and they were adopted into foam structures. But we had this surfactant, we had the materials already in place, but there was not a wide evaluation of other materials. They were provided, they worked, and they were adopted because of the need for safety and survivability. So there was a real kind of cart before the horse of the material was adopted into society before we really understood why it was working. There was plenty of literature to give ideas on why it was working, but really just the speed at which a fire went out and the ability to maintain coverage of that fuel blanket were so superior. It was very easily adopted into the fleet and into the world. Slide 44 or slide 45. So in the 2000s, there was the big realization that the fluorinated surfactant that was used in these AFFFs had a byproduct that would be PFAS, and it would go into the ground, and the fluorinated tail of the surfactants just wouldn't degrade, and it would stick around in the environment for a very, very long time. And there was a huge push to find replacements for these surfactants in firefighting foams. And unfortunately, between when AFFF was introduced and when we needed to find replacements, science had kind of caught up and said that the surfactant is quite key to the fire extinction process, that the surfactant itself, potentially through a variety of different mechanisms, is what is actually extinguishing the fire. It's not necessarily just the presence of the foam itself, creating that barrier, delivering that water. Their surfactant is really key. And not all surfactants could extinguish a fire. And because they were focused on the importance of the surfactant in AFFF, it was really hard to find an alternative surfactant. So what ended up happening is there was a back reliance on those natural and protein-based surfactants, things that had been developed that were considered more environmentally friendly. But could we add things to these mixtures to just make them better? So instead of focusing on let's have a massive change in surfactant chemistry, can we make small adjustments through additives and through other ingredients that will help get our firefighting foam to the level of that AFFF without having that fluorinated component? So there were significant developments in foam properties and understanding foam solution and foam property behavior, but most of it was not surfactant based. So there was a lot of kind of gap time in trying to better understand firefighting foams in which surfactant development was not the key. Slide 46. And what was the key at this time was that additives and was that focus on the foam layer and film formation. So AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, refers to a foam solution that has a low enough surface tension that an equation based on the spreading coefficient is positive. The only way for this to happen, to thermodynamically have a film spread onto a fire surface, is if your foam solution has a significantly low surface tension. And fluorinated surfactants achieve this. They have solution surface tensions less than 20 millinewtons per meter. And that was what people were focusing on. People were focusing on this film, in the presence of the film in fire suppression. And if you couldn't achieve it through surface tension, could you achieve it through something else? And there was this idea that liquid drainage from the foam could be very key in fire suppression. Could you get something that drained slow enough over time that it could create a pseudo film layer? And to get that slow drainage, you needed something that was like a very stable foam, and you needed to increase solution viscosity. And you ended up with very thick fluorine-free foams trying to recreate this film formation that was not thermodynamically possible. But in considering both of these mechanisms, it's understandable how we would measure foams and how we would look at foams and come to these conclusions, but they're really void of the fire environment. And both of these measurements don't really consider how foams behave in a fire environment. And at NRL, we wanted to probe that further. Slide 47. So what we found is, let's just take some components of a fire environment. And for us, a major component was the fuel. Looking at when you have a fuel pool and it is on fire, what does the presence of the fuel actually do to the foam? And we ran these very simple experiments. These are just 4 beakers with a 2 centimeter foam layer in them. And it has a control where the foam is placed on nothing. We have one type of fuel in the second beaker. In the third, we have the foam placed on water. And in the fourth, it is a different type of fuel. And as you go down the figures, it's the time at 0 minutes, 1 hour, and 5 hours. And what we found is that the fuel accelerates foam degradation. That when you compare the foam over the control or over water, the foams over the fuel degraded faster. So there's something about the interaction between the foam and the fuel layer that we thought was really important for fire suppression. Slide 48. And what we found is it's not just fuel, but it is fuel type. And we looked at 3 different fuels. And what was really fascinating about these 3 fuels is all had the same vapor pressure. They varied in solubility and surface tension. And what we got is a different foam stability with time. So how to read this plot is 0 indicates the initial film thickness that was 4 centimeters, and minus 100 on the y-axis is when the foam completely degraded from the fuel surface. And as you can see, with the same type of foam, this was an AFFF, you get varying levels of degradation depending on your fuel type. In slide 49. And what was even more exciting and surprising is that the fuel was affecting the surfactant as well. So when you had different surfactants, you would get different levels of foam degradation. And surfactant 1, 2, 3 in this plot are all fluorine-free. And you can see the blue one is our AFFF, and it has a much longer foam lifetime than the other fuels that we're looking at, than the other foams that we're looking at. So it wasn't just this film formation, but it's this clear indication of a stability of the foam in the presence of fuel. And we really wanted to better understand this fuel foam connection and thought that this was actually what was needed to be focused on, instead of just film formation and instead of just foam properties in the absence of fire elements. Slide 50. So we started to think more about this fuel foam interaction and what would be causing the degradation of the foam surface. And an idea that we had is we were considering you have the fuel layer and you have the foam layer, and you have fuel vapors that leave the fuel pool surface and travel through the foam layer. And how do they travel through the foam layer? Each bubble of a foam is surrounded with surfactant that is oriented with the head of the surfactant in the water layer and the tail of the surfactant in the air layer. And as fuel vapors come across those interfaces of each bubble, it interacts with the tail structure of the surfactant first. And we were considering the fluorinated surfactants and the fluorinated surfactant tail. And a fluorinated surfactant tail is not only resistant to water, but because of the structure of the bonds and the way that it interacts with itself and interacts with water and air, it is actually very oleophobic as well. And it retards fuel transport through the foam layer. And you end up with foams that do not have a significant amount of fuel vapor within their foam layers, making them stronger with time. However, if you have a hydrocarbon surfactant where the tail structure is almost identical to the fuel molecules, you have very easy transport through your foam layers, and you get a higher concentration of fuel vapors within your foam layer with time, which degrades your foam. So we were really looking for something that could mimic this oleophobic nature of the fluorinated surfactant. Slide 51. And where our research kind of took off was looking into silicon-based surfactants. So we had a hypothesis that you do want to mimic behavior of the fluorinated surfactant. And what is the behavior that we really want to mimic? We weren't necessarily looking to mimic the low surface tension ability of the fluorinated surfactant. We weren't looking to mimic film formation, but we thought that there was something about this oleophobicity and how the fluorinated tail just doesn't like anything. So you can see the structure of fluorine, the fluorinated surfactant with the tail group highlighted in yellow. And fluorine is just a non-stick chemical. It's what's used in Teflon, it's what's used in non-stick coatings because it really doesn't like to interact with anything. So we were considering other things that also don't like to interact with anything. And this is where silicon came into play. And there was some evidence already from other research groups that silicon surfactants might be replacements for fluorinated surfactants. However, it was highly based on the idea of film formation, that the silicon surfactants do produce solutions with low surface tensions, not low enough compared to fluorinated surfactants, but that was why they were really targeted as potential replacements, was because of film formation. And our research group wanted to focus on their role in stopping fuel transport through the foam layer and maintaining foam stability over fuel. Slide 52. And where to begin? We had this idea of a siloxane surfactant. We knew we wanted to incorporate it into a firefighting foam, but how do you do that? Where do you even start? We took some wisdom from manufacturers that said that individual surfactants aren't particularly good at extinguishing fires, and commercial products use mixtures of surfactants and additives to actually make something that can extinguish a fire. So what we did is we actually took individual components. We took a fluorinated surfactant, a alkyl surfactant, and solvent, and we mixed them in different ratios until we were able to develop a formulation that could match that of a commercial AFFF. And we refer to this as our reference AFFF. And it ended up being a 3-to-2 ratio by weight of a fluorinated surfactant and this alkyl surfactant that was at a total concentration 6 times its critical micelle concentration, and it had 0.5 weight% solvent in it to make sure that the surfactants dissolved readily. And we were able to get a 28-foot squared gasoline fire to extinguish in the same time as a commercial product. So we used that ratio, swapping out the fluorinated surfactant for a silicon one to really determine what was the potential performance of these silicon surfactants. Slide 53. And this is where we identified synergism and kind of that wisdom of the manufacturers and commercial products. We identified one commercial siloxane surfactant referred to as 502W. And these are image stills of a 19-centimeter pool fire. And foam was deposited into the center. And for the 502W, within 40 seconds, the fire has not been extinguished. we look at the other component of the mixture, which is just the alkyl surfactant that we added in that 3:2 ratio. If you look at just the alkyl surfactant, at 10 seconds, you can actually see that the pool fire is covered, that foam has covered the pool fire. At 20 seconds, that coverage is still there and the fire is still not out. At 40 seconds, the fire is still not out. And yet, when you mix the two materials together, we were able to get fire extinction within 40 seconds, which was very exciting to see synergism, not just in solution or foam properties, but a clear indication of you mix these two components together and you get synergism in fire suppression. Slide 54. And we were very excited about this mixture, especially considering we had examined other commercial surfactants, 14 products at least silicon containing, 15 that were not silicon containing. And out of that multitude of products that we tested in a 3:2 ratio, one extinguished our 19 centimeter pool fire, and it was this 502W formulation. And we decided that at bench scale, we would keep playing around with it. The 3:2 ratio for the reference AFFF was just a starting point. We mixed the ratio, we looked at different alkyl structures, and we did as much as we could through just iterative changes to improve extinction times and synergism. And when we got to the point where we thought that we had really optimized the structure, we took it from our bench scale 19 centimeter to a larger 28-foot squared gasoline and heptane pool fire. And the 28-foot squared pool fire is a qualification size for military firefighting foams. So it is the size that is used to evaluate foams for military use. And for a foam to qualify for military use under AFFF considerations, the gasoline fire extinction time must be under 30 seconds. And heptane is not a requirement, so it doesn't have a qualification. But we tested it because it is a neat fuel that is consistent with time and with batches, and it's a good fuel for bench scale evaluation. You can see the reference AFFF had almost identical times between gasoline and heptane, and our modified, our improved, our optimized 502W formulation showed no extinction on gasoline and a much longer extinction time on heptane. So despite our optimization at bench scale, we were still far away from reaching the AFFF target. Slide 55. So we considered what was needed to further improve and to further optimize. And we went back to the original structure of the AFFF fluorinated surfactant. And now what I have highlighted is, instead of the tail group, is the head group. And what we thought of is, and when we did background literature and research, is that not all fluorinated compounds will generate foams. Not all fluorinated compounds are used in fire suppression. This particular surfactant is used for fire suppression, and it's considered the most important for fire suppression, we think, because of this balance between the incredibly electronegative tail group and this very polar zwitterionic head group. And we looked at our 502W structure, which is shown below. And although it has a silicon-containing tail group that is lowering surface tension, is a very strong tail group, this PEO, polyoxyethylene head group, we think just wasn't strong enough, was not balancing the intensity of the tail group. So it wasn't just looking at synergism between surfactants, but even just synergism and balance on the same surfactant. And we were very much hoping to find alternative silicon chemistry that we could use for evaluations, but we kind of exhausted the commercial market and had to turn towards making our own. Slide 56. So at NRL, we have synthesized over 80 different siloxane surfactants through NRL scientists and collaborators. And this is a recent development that is very exciting. This is our series of zwitterionic siloxane surfactants, and we varied the tails, and we varied the oxygen linkers, we varied the branching on the tails, trying to again optimize the surfactant structure and seeing which one could be the most balanced. And we relied on knowledge from collaborators and from NRL chemists to know what this balance might be, because it's very difficult to measure and to know in advance if your surfactant is going to be balanced. And this one that is highlighted in green is the one that we moved forward with that, based on bench scale testing, seemed to show the most promising results. And those results, we can go to slide 57, were conducted on our 19 centimeter pool fire. We've also evaluated them on our 28-foot squared pool fire, and these are highlighted in a recent publication that is in the additional resources. But we tested out this new formulation, and on gasoline, so on gasoline, you can see our 502W formulation had, at bench scale, a long extinction time of 67 seconds. Reference AFFF was much faster. And our new tetra siloxane sulfobutane zwitterionic surfactant formulation had an extinction time of 28. So we were getting much closer, and it's very exciting that we were able to get this performance on gasoline. However, we're still missing out on some sort of dynamics that are fuel dependent, because if you look at the heptane extinction time, the 502W has a much closer extinction time to the reference AFFF than our zwitterionic formulation. So although we were able to improve extinction on gasoline, we have made performance on heptane slightly worse. And AFFF seems to be imperative to the fuel type. And it's very interesting, and something that we are following up with on how to make a surfactant that would be able to accommodate different fuel types. But we're very excited about this formulation, this zwitterionic formulation, and are going to continue optimizing this through different ratios and different alkyl surfactants to improve and optimize fire suppression performance. Slide 58. As we create new materials and as we put them in mixtures, we also evaluate them for toxicity. This is done through a collaboration with the Army Engineering Research and Development Center. And we particularly measure acute and chronic aquatic toxicity. And what I'm showing right here is the aquatic toxicity. And what we've really found is the fluorinated surfactant, which is shown all the way on the left, tends to be not toxic on its own, especially in an acute sense. The fluorinated surfactant has issues with its longevity, but in an acute aquatic toxicity test, it is not that lethal. When you mix it with an alkyl surfactant, which would be common in a commercial product, and that's the second one shown, your toxicity greatly increases. So we're not only seeing synergism in fire suppression, but there's synergism in toxicity. And we've looked at a range of other silicon-containing surfactants as well. And we have found that we have the opposite case for our 502W formulation. Our 502W formulation is less toxic than the 502W component alone. This is a really difficult test to conduct. It is time consuming to do these acute toxicity tests, and we don't know whether to provide every material that we evaluate for fire suppression, or if it's best to only give the ones that perform well. So because of this, there's a little bit of a backlog, and we are hopeful that we can start getting aquatic toxicity testing for that zwitterionic mixture soon. Slide 59. So that is a big continuation study for us, is the toxicity of this new zwitterionic siloxane mixture, looking at the aquatic toxicity of the material individually and as a mixture. And this fuel dependency is something that we will be focusing on in our research as well, especially the difference between gasoline and heptane, and how we can optimize a fluorine-free material that will have matched performance on different fuels. Another thing to point out specifically with siloxane surfactants is shelf life stability. Specifically, the silicon-oxygen bonds tend to hydrolyze, so they degrade in aqueous solution quickly. And once we find an optimized structure, we will then begin to optimize a formulation that will be more shelf life stable. Slide 60. So in conclusion, we definitely feel that the fuel foam fuel surfactant interaction is key to understanding and developing rapid fire extinguishing foams. And this can be achieved by optimizing mixtures, surfactant oleophobicity, and the balance between the surfactant head and tail group. But the parameter space for those three things is infinite, and we need much better small-scale testing to better identify these fuel surfactant interactions, to optimize faster, and to identify the appropriate components for firefighting foams. Slide 61. This greatly benefits the DoD through the use of new qualified foams for military use, coming up with an ideal mixture, an optimized mixture that can be used by the fleet is our goal, and it's what we continue to strive for, something with rapid fire extinguishment and long burn back capability. But this extends beyond just fire suppression into optimized surfactant mixtures that can be used for other things, such as cleaning products, water oil emulsions, paints, and other things. So better understanding surfactant mixtures and optimizing properties in mixtures for synergism is going to have a big effect on other applications. Slide 62. And for any more information about our specific experiments, we have a long list of publications. It has been a joy to work with collaborators and to work on these projects and to really gain a deep fundamental understanding of fuel surfactant systems for firefighting foams. Slide 63. And then our project pages are here for additional information, and I thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you so much, Katie. And I'll remind our audience to type in questions for Katie on this topic in the Q&A box. So first, Katie, can you talk about how to measure the oleophobicity or balance of a surfactant?
So that is a very challenging thing to do. In our research group, we have found that the oleophobicity in particular, so the strength of the tail group, can be fairly tied to the surface tension. That if you get a very low surface tension, not necessarily for film forming purposes, but for that strength of the surfactant tail, it's a good correlation. So we tend to prefer silicon surfactants that minimize surface tension to values of 21, 22 millinewtons per meter. Unfortunately, that measurement does not give you a lot of information about the balance of the surfactant and whether the head group has balanced it or not. And to do that, we have not identified a measurement yet, but we have developed a database of all of our surfactant results with surfactant structures all the way up to fire suppression performance. And we're hoping to do statistical correlations between surfactant descriptors such as the hydrophilic lipophilic balance and the octanol water partition coefficient that might be able to give us those correlations to tell us whether those surfactants are more balanced. But that research is still ongoing.
Okay, thank you. We've had a number of questions from the audience about environmental transport of siloxane surfactants. And I'm not sure whether you can answer that or let us know if there is work looking into that. We definitely appreciate you giving us information about toxicity, but do you know if these surfactants can transport easily in the environment? Are they persistent? Are they biodegradable?
I can't exactly comment on that in terms of we haven't done the measurements, but I will say two things. One is we were very fortunate to have our 502W formulation selected to be part of this large SERDP study to examine commercial fluorine-free products as well as upcoming and novel experimental products. And I believe there were 9 materials that were part of that study. And there have been publications in which there was a large research conglomerate that looked at acute aquatic, chronic aquatic, I think mammalian soil impacts, biodegradation, and that work has been published under other SERDP and ESTCP programs. So I highly encourage people to look for specifically the NRL 502W formulation to learn more about that. But it is specific to that 5-HW compound. And we have found that there are quite extreme differences in acute aquatic toxicity, depending on the silicon component, the silicon surfactant. So we are very eager to get additional information for our new Zwitter ionic structure to confirm that we are still working with a material that is not going to pose environmental issues.
Great. Okay, thank you. It's really interesting. Next, do the commercial fluorine-free foams use the silicone surfactants?
To my knowledge, 4 materials have now been qualified under a shore-based fluorine-free foam qualification standard. So this is different from the ones that are used for ship-based. It is a new standard that I believe was published in January 2023. And those 4 mixtures are not fluorine containing, but I am aware of a product that is being submitted that will contain a silicon surfactant in it. So it's not common in any way. And like I said, it has shelf life stability concerns, but we believe that it is a good path and a good research direction for NRL and for firefighting foams.
Okay, got it. And I think one last question for you before we bring Carrie back. You showed fire extinction times. Are there any other metrics besides that one that could be critical when developing firefighting foams?
Yeah, so in our research group, we do focus on that rapid extinction time. It is the goal of a lot of the foams that we develop, but we also must consider the burn back time, which is something that is measured in military qualification testing. And this goes back to that kind of initial 1960s roadblock. And burn back refers to the time between when the pool fire is essentially extinguished and then reignition. You introduce some sort of flame and wait to see how long it takes for that flame to spread across the foam blanket. So burn back is definitely one that should be considered. And then we also must consider just how these are going to be used in the real world and in military applications. So considering viscosity limitations and shelf life limitations to make sure that these things are going to be used by the fleet.
Got it. Okay, great. Thank you so much, Katie. All right, and now we'll go to Carrie. We have 2 questions for you to wrap up. Can you describe the most important remaining questions with respect to your work and maybe thinking a little bit about ultimately replacing AFFF and what the next steps in your research might be?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So the question about the impact of the fuel is a really big question. And that's something that we're still considering and still looking into. But in terms of trying to better understand the surfactant transport and the synergism, ultimately what we want is a thermodynamic and a rheological toolbox. And so we can understand what properties will correspond then to a stable foam. And so we have a new project where we're looking at a very specific formulation of a combination of surfactants that behave synergistically at an interface, that in the bulk they behave one way, at interface they behave quite differently. And we predict that this will have the right kind of thermodynamic response, that as the bubble size distribution is changing, it'll arrest coarsening, a destabilization mechanism, and produce a stable foam. So we're excited to look more into that formulation. And that's really our next direction.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Carrie. And then Katie, the last question for you to wrap up is about specs. You mentioned a new fluorine-free military specification. Can you say more about that and the different specifications and where that might be going, please?
Yeah, so I could have the year wrong. It might have been published in 2022 or 2023, but there is a new shore-based mil spec specific to fluorine-free foams, and it was developed in collaboration with NAPC and a lot of SERDP and ESTCP research and the Naval Research Lab to come up with metrics that would be appropriate for fluorine-free foams and appropriate for shore-based applications. So in that, this new formulation or this new spec doesn't require the use of salt water, which is true of the shipboard AFFF-based mil spec. It also has different viscosity requirements, recognizing that most of the commercial materials available are more viscous than AFFF. So currently there are two specs, one for shipboard, one for shore-based, but very much the goal is to move towards a unified spec that would be able to meet the rapid extinction requirements of AFFF and would demonstrate saltwater capability so it could be used by shipboard as well.
Okay, great. That's very helpful. Thank you to both of our speakers today for the wonderful and clear presentations and for answering all of the questions. And I just wanted to mention our next webinar in this series. It's on Thursday, November 7th. It's on DoD-funded research efforts on unmanned electromagnetic systems for geophysical classification of UXO in underwater environments. And you can visit the SERDP and ESTCP webinar webpage to register for this webinar and then also other webinars that are coming up. Before we conclude, I want to remind you that both the audio and a copy of the slides from today will be archived on the webinar webpage in case you would like to refer to them in the future. We would appreciate it if you could please take a moment now to complete the survey that will pop up on your screen. And this concludes today's webinar. Thank you.